Picture this. You're standing in the grand halls of a medieval castle in the year 1370, and you witness something that defies everything you thought you knew about power and politics. A child, barely tall enough to see over the massive throne she sits upon, is making decisions that will shape the fate of an entire kingdom. Her voice, still high and clear like any other 9-year-old, echoes through marble corridors as she commands armies, negotiates with foreign ambassadors, and signs documents that could mean life or death for thousands of her subjects. But this isn't some fairy tale or fantasy story. This is the true account of one of history's most remarkable and tragic figures, a girl who became a queen before she could even read properly, who wielded absolute power while other children her age were playing with dolls, and whose brief but extraordinary reign would end in circumstances so shocking that chroniclers of the time struggled to put them into words. Before we dive into this forgotten chapter of medieval history, if you're fascinated by these incredible true stories from the past, consider hitting that subscribe button and letting me know in the comments where you're watching from. It amazes me that we can explore these ancient tales together, connected across continents by our shared curiosity about the remarkable lives that came before us. What you're about to hear isn't just another story of royal intrigue. This is the account of how a child was thrust into a world of deadly politics, military campaigns, and court conspiracies that would challenge even the most experienced ruler. It's the story of how innocence collided with absolute power, and how a kingdom's desperate need for leadership placed an impossible burden on shoulders far too young to carry it. The girl's name was Isabella, though history would remember her by many titles: the child queen, the warrior princess, the martyred sovereign. But before she became any of those things, she was simply a daughter born into circumstances that would shape not just her own destiny, but the fate of an entire nation teetering on the edge of civil war. Let's begin with the kingdom she inherited, because understanding the chaos she was born into is crucial to grasping just how extraordinary her story truly becomes. The realm of Navarre in the 14th century was a powder keg waiting to explode. Squeezed between the expanding powers of France and Castile, this small but strategically vital kingdom had become the prize in a deadly game of medieval politics. Isabella's father, King Charles, had ruled with an iron fist for nearly 2 decades, but his reign had been marked by constant warfare, shifting alliances, and bitter rivalries that split the nobility into warring factions. The royal treasury was nearly empty from financing endless military campaigns, and neighboring kingdoms circled like vultures, waiting for any sign of weakness they could exploit. When Charles fell gravely ill in the winter of 1378, the vultures began to circle even closer. The king had no male heir, only this one precious daughter who had been carefully sheltered from the brutal realities of court life. Palace physicians worked desperately to save the monarch, but it became increasingly clear that the kingdom would soon need new leadership. The crisis deepened when Charles made a decision that shocked even his closest advisors. Rather than naming a regent to rule in his daughter's name, he chose to crown Isabella as his direct successor, granting her full royal authority despite her tender age. The coronation ceremony took place while the king lay dying in his chambers above, and witnesses described the surreal scene of a child barely able to lift the heavy crown being placed upon her head. But why would a dying king make such a seemingly reckless choice? The answer lies in the treacherous political landscape of medieval Europe. Charles knew that naming any adult as regent would essentially hand control of his kingdom to that person's family and allies. He had witnessed too many regencies turn into permanent coups, with child monarchs mysteriously disappearing or dying under suspicious circumstances. By crowning Isabella directly, Charles was making a calculated gamble. He believed that the legitimacy of her bloodline, combined with the loyalty of his most trusted supporters, would provide better protection than any regency arrangement. It was a desperate move by a desperate king, but it would prove to have consequences no one could have anticipated. The moment Isabella's crown touched her head, she became the target of forces that had been building for decades. Noble families who had been kept in check by her father's strong rule suddenly saw an opportunity to advance their own ambitions. Foreign powers that had been held at bay by Charles's military prowess began plotting invasions and interventions. Most dangerously of all, Isabella's own relatives, uncles, cousins, and distant family members began positioning themselves as alternative claimants to the throne. In the brutal calculus of medieval politics, a 9-year-old girl was seen not as a legitimate ruler, but as an obstacle to be removed at the earliest opportunity. The first months of Isabella's reign were a masterclass in survival against impossible odds. While other children her age were learning their letters and playing games, she was forced to navigate a court filled with adults who smiled to her face while plotting her downfall behind closed doors. Every meal could be poisoned, every friendly gesture could hide a dagger, and every piece of advice could be designed to lead her into a trap. Yet somehow, this remarkable child began to show qualities that amazed even her harshest critics. Isabella possessed an intuitive understanding of human nature that seemed far beyond her years. She could sense when courtiers were lying to her, identify which advisors truly had her best interests at heart, and make strategic decisions that kept her enemies off balance. Her first major test came just 3 months into her reign, when a coalition of rebellious nobles openly challenged her authority. They had expected the child queen to cower in her palace, perhaps flee to a neighboring kingdom, or at the very least hide behind her advisors, while they negotiated some face-saving compromise. Instead, Isabella did something that stunned everyone. She announced that she would personally lead her loyal forces against the rebels, despite being barely 10 years old and having never set foot on a battlefield in her life. The decision seemed like madness to many, but it revealed a strategic brilliance that would define her brief reign. Isabella understood something that her adult enemies had missed. In medieval warfare, morale was often more important than numbers or tactics. Her appearance on the battlefield, tiny figure though she was, would send a powerful message to both her supporters and her enemies. She was not some helpless child hiding behind palace walls. She was a queen willing to fight and die for her crown. The sight of their young monarch in armor, mounted on a horse that seemed far too large for her small frame, electrified Isabella's supporters and demoralized her enemies. Here was living proof that the royal bloodline still burned with the warrior spirit that had built the kingdom in the first place. But leading armies and winning battles were only part of the challenge Isabella faced. Back in the capital, she had to master the intricate dance of court politics while still maintaining the illusion that she was just a normal child. She learned to shift seamlessly between the role of commanding queen and innocent daughter, using both personas as weapons in her struggle for survival. The contradictions of her position were almost impossible to comprehend. In the morning, she might be reviewing military dispatches and planning strategic campaigns that would determine the fate of thousands. In the afternoon, she would be expected to attend lessons with tutors who still treated her like any other noble child learning basic arithmetic and Latin. This double life took an enormous psychological toll that would have broken most adults, let alone a child. Isabella began showing signs of the immense pressure she was under. Periods of intense focus followed by moments of overwhelming exhaustion, bursts of mature wisdom alternating with flashes of the frightened child she truly was underneath all the royal ceremony. As Isabella approached her 13th birthday, the pressures of her impossible position began manifesting in ways that alarmed even her most loyal supporters. Court physicians noted that the young queen often suffered from severe headaches that would leave her bedridden for days. She had developed nervous habits, constantly fidgeting with her jewelry, biting her nails until they bled, and speaking in rapid bursts followed by long periods of unsettling silence. Yet even as her body showed signs of breaking under the strain, Isabella's political instincts continued to sharpen with each passing crisis. She had learned to read the subtle language of court intrigue, the meaningful glances exchanged between conspirators, the careful phrasing of seemingly innocent questions, the way conversations would halt abruptly when she entered a room. The most dangerous threat to her reign emerged not from foreign armies or rebellious nobles, but from within her own family. Her uncle Ferdinand had been quietly building support among the kingdom's merchant class, promising them reduced taxes and expanded trade privileges in exchange for their loyalty. Unlike the crude military challenges Isabella had faced before, this was a sophisticated political campaign designed to gradually erode her support base. Ferdinand's strategy was particularly insidious because he never openly challenged Isabella's legitimacy. Instead, he positioned himself as her devoted protector and advisor, all while systematically undermining her authority behind the scenes. He would publicly praise her wisdom and courage, then privately whisper to influential nobles about how tragic it was that such a young girl had to bear such enormous responsibilities. The psychological warfare was devastating for Isabella. She found herself questioning every decision, second-guessing advisors she had previously trusted, and becoming increasingly isolated as paranoia crept into her thoughts. The child who had once displayed such remarkable confidence now struggled with crippling self-doubt that made even simple choices feel overwhelming. But Ferdinand had underestimated the depth of Isabella's survival instincts. Despite her youth and the enormous pressures she faced, she began developing a network of informants throughout the kingdom: servants, merchants, minor nobles, and even children who could move through the palace unnoticed. This intelligence network allowed her to stay one step ahead of her uncle's schemes while maintaining the appearance of naive innocence. The final confrontation between Isabella and Ferdinand came during the harvest festival of 1383, when the young queen was just 14 years old. Ferdinand had planned what he believed would be his masterstroke, a public ceremony where he would reluctantly accept the role of regent to protect Isabella from the burdens of rule. He had secured the support of key nobles and planned to present his takeover as a compassionate rescue of an overwhelmed child. What Ferdinand hadn't anticipated was that Isabella had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. As he rose to address the assembled court with his carefully rehearsed speech about the need for more experienced leadership, Isabella stood and delivered what witnesses described as the most powerful speech of her short life. Speaking with a clarity and authority that silenced the entire hall, she systematically dismantled Ferdinand's arguments while revealing evidence of his secret negotiations with foreign powers. Documents were produced showing that her uncle had promised territorial concessions to neighboring kingdoms in exchange for military support for his planned coup. Letters were read aloud detailing Ferdinand's willingness to sacrifice the kingdom's independence for personal power. The revelation that Ferdinand had been prepared to sell out his own country for political advantage turned public opinion decisively against him. The nobles who had been wavering in their support rallied around Isabella, seeing her not as a vulnerable child but as the rightful defender of the kingdom's sovereignty. Ferdinand's attempted coup collapsed within hours, and he was forced to flee the kingdom in disgrace. For Isabella, it represented the greatest triumph of her reign, proof that intelligence and preparation could overcome even the most sophisticated political conspiracy. But victory came at a terrible cost. The stress of the confrontation, combined with years of living under constant threat, had pushed Isabella's fragile health to its breaking point. The headaches that had plagued her for months became debilitating migraines that left her unable to function for days at a time. Her appetite disappeared almost entirely, and her already slight frame became alarmingly thin. Palace physicians tried every remedy they knew, from herbal treatments to bloodletting, but nothing seemed to help. Modern medical historians believe Isabella was likely suffering from what we would now recognize as severe stress-related illness, possibly complicated by an autoimmune disorder triggered by years of psychological trauma. Despite her declining health, Isabella refused to slow down or delegate responsibilities to others. She seemed driven by an awareness that time was running out, pushing herself to accomplish as much as possible while she still could. In her final months, she worked with almost manic intensity to establish laws and institutions that would survive her death and protect her kingdom from future internal conflicts. The end came suddenly in the spring of 1385. Isabella had been reviewing diplomatic correspondence in her private chambers when she suddenly collapsed, blood flowing from her mouth and nose. The palace erupted into chaos as physicians rushed to her aid, but it was clear that whatever had been slowly destroying her body had finally claimed victory. Isabella died 3 days later, just weeks after her 15th birthday, surrounded by the advisors and supporters who had helped her navigate 6 years of impossible challenges. Her final words, according to those present, were not about her own fate, but about the future of her kingdom. "Promise me you will choose wisely who comes after. Promise me you will not let them destroy what we have built." The aftermath of Isabella's death revealed just how much her presence had been holding the kingdom together. Within months, the realm descended into the very civil war her father had tried to prevent by crowning her. Noble factions that had been kept in check by loyalty to the young queen immediately began fighting among themselves for control. Foreign armies that had been deterred by Isabella's surprising military successes quickly invaded, carving up the kingdom between competing powers. The sophisticated governmental systems she had established were swept away by warlords more interested in immediate plunder than long-term stability. Perhaps most tragically, the merchant class and common people who had prospered under Isabella's protection found themselves at the mercy of rulers who viewed them merely as sources of taxation and military conscription. The brief golden age of relative peace and prosperity that had emerged during her reign vanished as if it had never existed. Today, Isabella's story remains largely forgotten, overshadowed by the more famous monarchs and dramatic events that followed. But for those 6 extraordinary years, a child who should have been learning to read and write instead mastered the deadly art of survival in medieval politics. She proved that true leadership has nothing to do with age or physical strength, and everything to do with intelligence, courage, and an unshakable commitment to protecting those who depend on you. Her legacy reminds us that history is shaped not just by the mighty conquerors and famous battles we read about in textbooks, but also by the quiet heroes who faced impossible odds with remarkable grace. Isabella's story deserves to be remembered not as a curiosity about a child queen, but as a testament to the extraordinary strength that can emerge when circumstances demand the impossible from an ordinary person. In choosing death over surrender, in refusing to abandon her responsibilities even when they were slowly killing her, Isabella embodied the very best of what leadership can be. She remains a shining example of how even the briefest life can leave an indelible mark on history.